Forgotten and excluded from my parents' wedding after 25 years together. I exposed their neglect on social media and revealed the truth. Growing up, I always thought family was a bond that couldn't be broken, something that shielded you from the storms of life. But what if that very shield turns out to be full of cracks, leaving you exposed to the harsh elements you were hoping to avoid? What if the people meant to love you most turn out to be the very ones that push you away? This is my story, a story of neglect, alienation, heartbreak, and, eventually, rediscovery. It all started innocently enough. My parents had been together for over 25 years but had never married. For most of my life, it was just our family, mom, dad, my elder sister, my brother, and me. We lived comfortably. My parents provided everything we needed. To the outside world, we were a normal, close-knit family. However, under the surface, there were fractures that only grew deeper over time. My parents had favored children, and unfortunately, I wasn't one of them. Earlier this year, my father proposed to my mother on their anniversary. My siblings and I were overjoyed, finally. After all these years, they were going to make it official. Preparations started almost immediately for a modest wedding ceremony in Hawaii, inviting only close friends and family. My mother asked my sister to be her maid of honor, and my father asked my brother to be his groomsman. They all seemed thrilled, but my heart sank as I realized I had been completely forgotten. I wasn't asked to be a part of the wedding in any way. I had always known that I wasn't as close to my parents as my siblings were. My sister was my mother's golden girl. They shared countless hours shopping, having lunch dates, and bonding over things I never had an interest in. My brother was just like my dad. They spent their weekends watching football, fixing cars, and talking about sports. I tried to join them at times, but it never seemed to work out. I was different, and over time, I started believing I wasn't enough. Not enough for my parents, not enough for my siblings, not enough for anyone. During the wedding preparations, my sister suggested her 3-year-old daughter be the flower girl, which replaced any small role I might have had. My grandmother even suggested that I read a poem during the ceremony. But my parents declined, saying they wanted to keep things simple. I knew that my absence wouldn't matter to anyone. As the wedding day approached, they all grew busier, dress shopping, meeting with event organizers, planning the details, but I was excluded from it all. I watched them leave for Hawaii without me, leaving me alone with my thoughts. When I say I was forgotten, I don't mean it metaphorically. They literally forgot to get me a ticket. They booked first-class seats for my siblings and their friends, but not for me. They hadn't thought of me once during the entire process. The night before they were to leave, my mother asked if I had my suitcase ready. When I asked her if I even had a ticket, her face went pale. My parents argued about me being unprepared, but I pointed out that they hadn't even bought me a ticket. They snapped at me to find a budget airline ticket at the last minute if I wanted to come. I remember my dad walking in and telling me to suck it up, that I could just wear something I already had. That was it. That was the last straw. I had been excluded from countless things before, but this hurt more than anything else. It wasn't just about not being invited. It was about being made to feel like an afterthought, a burden, someone who didn't belong. In my family, everyone had a place except for me. So, I stayed home. When my parents and siblings came back, they shared photos online of how magical and perfect the trip was. And their friends asked why I wasn't there. My parents claimed I had been sick, that I had gotten COVID just before the trip. That hurt even more. Not only had they left me behind, but now they were lying about me to protect themselves. I took to social media to tell my side of the story. I revealed what had really happened, not out of spite, but because I wanted my voice to be heard. I was tired of being overlooked, of being treated as if I didn't matter. People began to notice and reached out to me, strangers I had never met before, to show support and share their own stories of family neglect. It was through this community of strangers that I found a little bit of solace. For the first time, I realized I wasn't alone in my pain. I reached out to my grandmother, who had always been the only adult who seemed to see me. My grandmother had once suggested I read a poem at the wedding, but I had dismissed the idea, thinking it was her just trying to give me something to do. When I told her everything that had happened, she wasn't surprised, but she was deeply hurt on my behalf. She promised to support me however she could. She and my uncle flew in to help me move out. It was one of the most emotional moments of my life. Seeing my grandmother at the airport, someone who loved me unconditionally. Who was there when my parents had failed me? My grandmother and uncle confronted my parents when we arrived at my house. My mother broke down, apologizing, but it was hard for me to believe in her tears. My father remained silent. I packed my things and left, with my grandmother reassuring me that I would never have to return unless I wanted to. The confrontation with my parents was not about revenge. It was about letting them know that I had finally found the courage to leave, to seek a better life for myself without them. My parents offered to throw a big party for me to make up for it and even buy me a car. I refused. No party, no gift could make up for the years of exclusion and neglect I had faced. I moved in with a friend who was also starting college, and we decided to rent a small place together. It wasn't much, but it was ours. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was building something for myself, without relying on my parents. I also started therapy to work through the years of pain and neglect, to learn how to trust myself again, and to stop blaming myself for my family's behavior. My therapist helped me understand that my parents' actions were not my fault, that I wasn't responsible for their inability to love me the way I needed to be loved. My grandmother supported me financially for a while, but I was determined to be independent. I started working part-time while balancing my studies. I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it, that I could stand on my own 2 feet. I no longer wanted to be at the mercy of my parents' whims, depending on them for money or validation. My grandmother continued to be a source of strength for me, always reminding me that I was loved and that I mattered. There were moments when my parents tried to reach out. My mother would cry whenever I visited to collect my things, and my father apologized in a way that felt hollow, as if he didn't truly understand the depth of the hurt they had caused. My sister continued to be dismissive, calling me dramatic and accusing me of tearing the family apart. My brother, on the other hand, seemed to have a change of heart. He reached out with a sincere apology, acknowledging how he had failed to see my pain all these years. I appreciated his words, but I knew that I needed time before I could even think about rebuilding any kind of relationship with him. In the midst of all this, I also started reflecting on my privilege. My parents were wealthy, and I had never had to worry about money growing up. Despite their emotional neglect, they had provided me with financial stability. I had attended private school, received an allowance, and never had to think about whether we could afford something. It made me feel guilty to complain about my life when so many others had it worse. But I realized that emotional neglect is a form of abuse. And just because I had money didn't mean I wasn't allowed to feel pain. My parents had given me everything except the one thing I needed most: love. One of the most profound things I learned during this time was that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who are there for you, who support you, who make you feel seen and heard. My grandmother was my family. My friend, who took me in when I had nowhere else to go, was my family. The strangers on the internet who offered me words of comfort and understanding were my family. I learned to redefine what family meant to me, and that was incredibly freeing. There were days when I questioned everything. I wondered if I had made the right choice by leaving, if I was overreacting, if I was truly as unlovable as my parents had made me feel. But every time I doubted myself, I remembered the look on my grandmother's face when she hugged me at the airport, the pure, unconditional love in her eyes. I wasn't unlovable. I had just been looking for love in the wrong places. My story isn't unique. There are so many people out there who feel like the black sheep of their family, who feel like they don't belong, who are constantly overlooked and made to feel like they aren't enough. To those people, I want to say, you are enough. You deserve love, and you deserve to be seen. It's okay to walk away from people who hurt you, even if those people are your family. It's okay to put yourself first and seek out the love and support you need. I've come a long way since that day my parents left for Hawaii without me. I built a life for myself that I'm proud of. I'm still healing, still working through the pain, but I'm no longer that scared, neglected girl sitting at home wondering why her family didn't love her. I'm stronger now, and I know that my worth isn't determined by whether or not my parents see me. I see myself, and that's enough. In life, we don't get to choose the family we're born into, but we do get to choose the people we surround ourselves with. We get to choose who we call family. I've learned that the hard way, but I'm grateful for the lesson. My grandmother once told me that family is supposed to be your safe place. But if your family is the storm, then it's okay to build your own shelter. And that's exactly what I've done. So, if you're listening to this and you feel like you don't belong, like your family doesn't see you, I want you to know that you're not alone. There are people out there who will love you for exactly who you are. You just have to find them. And sometimes, you have to be brave enough to walk away from the people who don't. After my dad remarried, he neglected me and prioritized his new family, making me feel like a guest in his home. Am I the jerk for resenting him? The journey of a young girl's heartbreak starts with love and ends with self-discovery. Imagine being 12 years old, watching your dad, the person you looked up to the most, slowly drift away as his world became filled with new people, a new wife, new kids, a new family, and suddenly, the daughter who was once his best friend felt like she didn't belong. This is the story of a girl finding her place in a chaotic world, learning the true meaning of love, and ultimately finding a real home where she was accepted for who she was. When I was a young child, my dad was everything to me. My parents divorced when I was just an infant, but I never felt like I was missing out on anything. I spent weekdays with my mom and weekends with my dad, and those weekends were magical. Every Friday night, we picked out a stack of movies to watch together. We'd go on adventures, bike to hidden playgrounds, fish by the lake, and laugh until our stomachs hurt. He wasn't just my father, he was my best friend, my hero. My mother was loving, but there was something about the time I spent with my dad that made me feel special. But then, everything began to change. My dad had dated before. I'd seen him with girlfriends who never stayed too long. I was used to it, and most of them were kind. One stayed for 2 years, and I even got attached to her. But when she left, it didn't change much between me and my dad. We were still the same duo. That was until I turned 12 and my dad met someone new. This time, the girlfriend wasn't just passing through. Within 2 weeks, she and her children moved into my dad's small apartment. Suddenly, my space was invaded. My small, cozy room, with my little bed, my drawers, my posters on the wall, was no longer mine. My dad tried to make room for them, but my bed was soon pushed into a corner, then into a closet. They said it was temporary, but I felt the shift. I felt the emptiness where my connection with my dad used to be. And when he moved to a bigger house, I hoped that maybe I'd get my room back, my space back, but it wasn't meant to be. His new wife's older daughter got her own room, while I had to share with the younger one. My small drawer was reduced to one tiny section, while everything else was filled with someone else's toys and clothes. My dad kept telling me that this was all about sharing and being family. But I didn't feel like family anymore. I felt like an outsider. The worst part was when my dad married her without even telling me. I found out weeks after their courthouse wedding. I found out about my new half-sibling after she was born and brought home from the hospital. It felt like everything was happening without me, as if I didn't matter anymore. My dad prioritized his new family so much that he stopped paying child support for me. He focused on making his new family happy, paying for college for his stepdaughter, indulging his young stepchild, and making sure his new wife was comfortable. And I, his own daughter, was forgotten. I didn't stop visiting right away. I tried to hang on. I kept hoping things would get better. But every weekend, it just became more evident that I was not welcome. My bed stayed in the closet. My stepmother wasn't happy to see me. My stepsiblings didn't care to include me in anything. And my dad was too busy. Too busy with work. Too busy with them. Too busy to listen to me. He ranted about his opinions, about conspiracy theories, and his new business. But whenever I tried to share something about my life, he brushed me off. I was no longer his daughter. I was just someone who came to visit. Over time, I began visiting less and less. It was too painful to be there. It was easier not to go. My stepfather was there at home with my mom, and he was kind. He was nothing like my dad. He didn't try to replace him, but he was there when I needed someone. He believed in me when I said I wanted to be a writer. He encouraged me, bragged about my books, called me his daughter, and eventually, I started to feel closer to him than I did to my own father. One Christmas, I visited my dad. He had bought presents for everyone in his new family, wrapped them up with care. He took me to the store, handed me some money, and said, "Merry Christmas, buy yourself something." It hurt more than anything. I wasn't part of his family. I was a guest who was just there out of obligation. He didn't care to know what I wanted or what would make me happy. He didn't even care that he wasn't paying child support. I realized that I didn't matter to him anymore. Not really. When I tried to talk to my mom about it, she said things that confused me. One moment she called him a deadbeat. The next she said he was my father and I should respect him. She said I should visit to keep him out of trouble with the courts. But I didn't want to visit anymore. I didn't want to feel like a stranger in the place that was supposed to be my home. The last time I visited my dad, I decided it would be the final chance. I wanted to see if there was anything left of the father I used to love. But it was a disaster from the start. He picked me up, and I tried to tell him about my new project, a business idea I had. He called it stupid, a waste of time. He launched into his rants about politics, immigrants, and how the world was falling apart. Everything I said made him angry. Every time I tried to share something, he dismissed it. I realized that the father I used to know was gone. He was someone else now, someone who didn't see me, didn't care about me, and certainly didn't love me the way I needed him to. It took me a long time to understand that it wasn't my fault. I wasn't the reason he changed. He chose to focus on his new life, his new family, and he left me behind. I tried to hold on, tried to be the daughter he used to love, but it wasn't enough. It was never about me. It was about him, his choices, and his inability to see the value in what he had before it was too late. Now, I'm focusing on my future. My stepfather may not be able to adopt me legally, but he loves me, he supports me, and that's more than my biological father has done for a long time. I'm working on my books, focusing on school, and making plans for my future. I want to go to college, to make something of myself, and prove to myself that I am worth it, even if my father couldn't see it. I dedicated my first book to him, to the father he used to be, and I don't regret it. That part of him was real, and that part of him mattered to me. But now, it's time for me to move on. This story is not just about the pain of a broken relationship. It's about finding strength in the face of neglect and abandonment. When someone you love changes and leaves you behind, it's easy to blame yourself. It's easy to think that you did something wrong, that if only you were better, they would love you again. But the truth is, sometimes people change in ways we can't control, and it has nothing to do with us. In life, we often look for validation from people who are supposed to love us unconditionally. We expect our parents to always be there, to always care, to always support us. But when that doesn't happen, it doesn't mean that we are unworthy of love. It just means that the love we need is somewhere else. It might be in a step-parent who steps up, in a friend who listens, or in ourselves when we learn to stand on our own. The narrator's journey is a powerful reminder that love is not always where we expect it to be. But it is out there. And sometimes, the family we choose, or the family that chooses us, is the one that truly matters.